Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining to our webinar. We are already 26 participants, so I suppose that we can start. This lecture is done within Future Environmentalist project with support of Erasmus Plus program of European Union. My name is Jan Kaspar. That is my necessary mask. And I work for the Faculty of Forestry and Wood Sciences in Prague. And we are one of the partners in the Future Environmentalist project. And Bulgarian Biodiversity Foundation, which is other partner of our project, will be hosting this webinar for us today. Today we should speak about international conservation policy, and in the first part, and in the next part, in the second webinar, about forests in the world. Today's lecturer is Dr. Plesník from Nature Conservation Agency of the Czech Republic, and I will give him the floor in some seconds. I kindly remind you to keep your microphones muted unless you want to raise some question. You can also use the chat for your questions, and I will read it at the end in the discussion. I will read your questions in the chat, and Dr. Plesník will answer on that. I would like also inform you that this webinar will be recorded, and you can find the record in YouTube on our educational toolkit website. You can find the link for the website in the chat. So please go there. You can find a lot of many interesting materials, not just from these webinars. Okay, now it's probably time to start. Welcome, Dr. Plesník, here again, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, friends. It really is a pleasure and honor for me to have the possibility to share some views on the topics related to conservation policy today, and special thanks to Professor Kaspar for managing it and for allowing me to participate in this course, and also to the Bulgarian Biodiversity Foundation for hosting the meeting. I would like to inform students of the course on conservation policy that we have got the information from the university that the final state exams are planned to be carried out during the last week of August, and my intention is therefore to come with the dates for the exam from conservation policy as soon as possible, ideally in April or in May. It depends when the university will be reopened again, but really I would like to do it as soon as possible. Therefore, so I move rather the webinars to give you more time, not only for preparing for the state final exams, but also for developing and elaborating on your diploma or Master of Sciences thesis. So it was, let me say, from the housekeeping issue, and now we can deal with our today topic. And we should deal with the international, that means global, pan-European, and the EU conservation policy, because topic is quite broad. So I will try namely to concentrate on the European Union conservation and environmental policy, and I'm going to explain why the special attention is given to this issue. Let me start with the reasons for developing international cooperation in nature conservation and management. First, there is the, let me say, well-known truth, which is almost a platitude, that nature doesn't respect country borders, or nature doesn't respect geopolitical borders. it is quite true, and I can only illustrate it on the case of one wader species, which is very nice bird species inhabiting Eurasia, and it is called black-tailed godwit. And in the fact, this species is declining in the European Union, and there is a really huge effort to it's limosa, and it is a huge effort to stop the decline. And some countries have used to pay through the various subvention schemes or agro-environmental schemes to pay the farmers, for example, when they are willing to start with the, for example, moving their meadows later in the season to give the bird chance to come with the young to be reared in nest and so on. And for example, one of the key countries from point of view of this species, in addition to the United Kingdom, is the Netherlands, and the Dutch government pays for one individual of this species approximately 100 euros each season. And you can imagine that the total amount is relatively high, because this is really the country is the threshold of the European population. And now imagine the situation, then you can buy 10 of these birds, of course killed for food. For example, I have the personal experience from the market in Dakar, in the capital of Senegal, and you can buy 10 of them for $5 or €5. Yeah, that means that on one side there is huge effort for some governments or nations to maintain the species, and on the other hand it is massively killed. And therefore this is one of the reasons for developing international cooperation in nature conservation and management. The second issue is that as we tried to stress during one of our previous lecture, when tackling the issue of global difficulties or global problems, is that these problems are really global or regional, that means pan-European or within the EU, and simply they cannot be solved within one single country. That means again that the international cooperation or international collaboration is extremely needed. And also saving capacities. It is not only if there is, for example, some joint program or project or some bilateral measurement taken, but also sharing experience and lesson learned and so on. That means that the capacity can be in fact saved when handling to some joint nature conservation issue by more than the single country. Then another reason is setting the common priorities, because I would like only to remind us that what was said during the very first presentation, at the time it was face-to-face lecture, that due to lack of funds, lack of human capacities, and very often lack of knowledge, and namely lack of time, we are not able to conserve or to protect or to manage each pieces of nature we wish to do it. And therefore we definitely have to seek for priorities, and sometimes even more to seek for priorities among priorities. And this is the issue of conservation planning, a special scientific discipline which try to provide us with the priority species or priority habitats, priority ecosystem processes, of course based on the best science available and evidences, not based on the lobbying or feeling, but on the science available. And these priorities can be common, like I try to explain to you on the case of this black-tailed gadwit. And then conservation planning, and then also, as I mentioned, exchange good practices, lesson learned, and failures. It is a very important issue because due to various stage of development, economic, culture, historical, and so on, some countries have been facing the difficulties which were the problems for some other some years ago, and they have good practices or lesson learned, and on the other hand, failures. And this is extremely important because, for example, do you remember that I tried to show to you during last lecture that, for example, with respect of wetland, now the wetlands are massively destroyed in developing countries. That means that developing countries are repeating the mistake we had done 50 years ago or a century ago, and therefore it is really of utmost importance to share this view and try to really to seek for the possibilities to avoid repeating mistake of failures. By the way, I can recommend to you, now there are two very nice articles published in scientific literature wrapping up the most common failure in nature conservation, based on a very huge database, analyzing where, when, and why we are making mistakes in nature conservation. Why the projects or program dealing with species conservation, territorial conservation, ecosystem processes conservation have failed. And again, I would like to remind us and apologize to my students because I said it during the first presentation, the attempt of Greenpeace made some years ago when they put together 200 best and most successful stories in the environmental protection, and they were seeking for the common nominator. Whether it is because the topic were some charismatic species, or whether it was because there was a lot of funds available in developed countries, or whether it was because the issue was very much related to diseases or health care issues. And they found the only common denominator for all these most successful stories, and this was so-called participatory approach. That means it was that in the fact all stakeholders have been involved from the beginning, and they said these measures, this project, this program is also our. This is not something coming from the capital, something from crazy NGOs or so on, but something which is really our, and we are proud to be one of the stakeholders. And this is again the stressing the killer of SIPA, that means communication, education, and public awareness. The photo I put there is from the Slovak Poloniny National Park in the northern, close to the border with Poland. This is in the fact Bilateral National Park. And now there is Pieniny National Park in Slovakia and Pieniny National Park in Poland. In Poland, it was established in 1928, and this is the first bilateral protected area in Europe, because it was established in 1928 on the Slovak and Polish side, but at the time it was not national park. It was the nature reserve in the former Czechoslovakia, and only I guess 3 months early there was the very first bilateral protected area in the world, and this was in the northern part of the US in the state of Washington and southern Canada, 2 national parks. That means that, but anyhow, this is the very first bilateral protected area in Europe. That means protected area which is shared by 2 nations or 2 countries. And when thinking about, let me say, taxonomy or classification of the international cooperation in nature conservation, I guess the best way how to do it is to really to try to seek whether they are legal binding. That means that they are part of the legislation, and these are called hard law. But soft laws are, for example, other activities like various, for example, charts or declaration and so on. And if we will go through these key, that means first to seek whether some cooperation is really legally binding, that means that is a duty of the country. And then we should start with the implementation of the European Union legislation, which is of course legally binding, and we are going to elaborate on this more later in this lecture. Then the second category or class of the international cooperation could be called multilateral biodiversity-related agreements. That means these are various conventions or protocols, and they are multilateral. That means they are more than, for example, agreement on the joint approach to nature conservation between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. These are really multilateral. That means at least 3 countries called parties are considered or assumed to really to be involved in the implementation of these conventions. And they are also hard law because they are legally binding, but there is always some but, and but in this case is because of the fact that they are legally binding, but they are based on so-called Vienna Convention on the multilateral agreements. And this idea is based on very logic but unrealistic presumption, saying that if party becomes if country becomes a party to the convention, it is the signal that it is willing and prepared to fulfill all duties which are included in this multilateral agreement. That means this is very idealistic, and there are at this moment only 2 conventions dealing within biodiversity or nature conservation, having something which we should call enforcement tools. That means tools which they use really to remember the countries on their duties. And all others have some softer measures, like something like blacklist, where the country is given if there is some evidence that it is not meeting the targets or the legal consequences of this convention. That means, but still officially they are hard law because they are part of the international legislation. The third group of international cooperation are international, intergovernmental, and non-governmental organizations. What is the difference between intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations? Intergovernmental organizations are organizations which are open only for governments. That means that only governments can become a party to the convention or member of the organization, or a being involved in the implementation of various programs and projects and so on. Probably the best known international intergovernmental organizations are so-called United Nations agencies, like, for example, UNI, or formerly called UNEP, that means United Nations Environment, or in the past known as United Nations Environment Program, or FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or UNESCO, dealing with the science and the culture and education issues. And also let me remind us about IPBES, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Environment Services. And these are really under the, let me say, umbrella of United Nations, and only few are in the, let me say, also framework of the European Union, and these are the intergovernmental organization. NGO, I'm sure that it is not necessary to explain it, but it is necessary also to distinguish between international NGOs, which are covering more than one nation, one country. They can be, for example, like BirdlIfe International, consisting of the partners in each country or most of countries, or they can be really open more to the organizations and where, for example, can be more organizations from one country becoming a member. For example, similarly to the, or such as EUROPARC, that means Federation of European National Nature Park and Protected Areas. And these international non-governmental organizations are key players in the arena of international cooperation in nature conservation, because having really support from not only their members, but also from general public, it is crucial really to know the let me remind us the Latin proverb, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, and this organization are sometimes even making something like umbrella organization. For example, many of these organizations on nature conservation in the European Union joined so-called European Habitats Forum, and that is the only international non-governmental organization having a status of the observer to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and this is the most important international nature conservation non-governmental organization called IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is surprisingly consisting not only from NGOs, both national and international, but also from the members could be government agencies like mine, or even governments. That means that IUCN is really the most influential nature conservation non-governmental organization, because this is a platform for collaboration between governments and NGOs. And this, and allow me again to stress the fact that in Europe, our NGOs are in a different position with respect of funding, that, as I tried to explain to you during the first face-to-face lecture, that many of the US or Canadian NGOs are in fact foundations having budget some orders of magnitude higher than even than the European NGO with the highest budget, which is RSPB, Royal Society for the for bird preservation in the UK. That means this is difference that one of the, for example, this is the most influential organization, NGO based in the US, but having international status called Conservation International, for example, was able to grant it some other organization or some governments, for example, with $1 billion for preservation of tropical rainforest. This is quite huge amount of money. The fourth type of the international cooperation are international programs, projects, and initiatives. That means they are definitely soft law. They are not legal binding, coming with some ideas. And I would like only to remind us about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which I mentioned during the presentation of the Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital concept, which was held 5 years at the beginning of the millennia because of the title, up to 25, restoring or recovering the idea of ecosystem services, which was really a huge mega scientific program. And then there are bilateral and transboundary cooperation, and it is necessary to say that some of the non-government organizations are so-called private. That means that the members could be individuals, and most important private organization in the world dealing with nature conservation is former World Wildlife Fund, which is now called World Fund for Nature, Worldwide Fund for Nature, indicating that they move from wildlife to also to issue of habitats or ecosystem or social aspects of nature conservation. And this is the organization with the famous logo of Jan Panda, drawn by Sir Peter Scott, and this is most influential private NGO and this moment dealing with closely with or only with the nature conservation, contrary to organization like for example Greenpeace dealing generally with the environment issues, because having more than 5 million members across the world. And I will try to pay attention to the European Union legislation because it is legal binding. It is very much influencing nature conservation, not only in the European Union, but also worldwide. And it is also issue which is very much debated and which can show us simply said really strong and weak issues and opportunities and threats of nature conservation at the regional scale. That means at the scale at this moment, 27 member states. Let us start with the fact that the EU member states have conferred a part of their sovereign rights to the European Union. And I would like to stress the fact that before the Lisbon Treaty, which was approved in 29, European Union has no legal status. The legal status was given from the very beginning, that means from the year 1958 to the European communities. And even after the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, European Union was something like a territory. But the legal entity were European communities. And because sometimes there was confusion about European Union and European communities, then it was changed, And since the approval of the Lisbon Treaty, now we can speak about European Union legislation, but before it was a really European community, or even, let me say, more narrower European Economic Community legislation. And you can very simply recognize it when going through the various titles of the individual pieces of pieces of European Union legislation, where the last information behind the last slash was in the past EC or EEC, and now it is EU. Yeah, because at the time it was really, for example, regulation or directives of the European communities, and now it is, of course, piece of legislation of the European Union. That means it is now much more clear. It is now really that even legislation is in the fact issued by the European Union, not by the European community. I took a photo this is one of the windows of the building where European Council has used to meet. That means the head of states, head of the EU member states are met each month or 2 months, and also ministers from various sectors have used to meet in Brussels in this building. But you can see in the mirror, this is the headquarters of the European Commission, so-called Parlement Paris. And what is very important is that because the EU member states have conferred a part of their sovereign rights to the European Union, the European Union law, the European Union legislation, sometimes it is called by the French name acquis communautaire, is legally binding for member states. That means this is not like the Multilateral Convention, that if there is some task and the country is not able to fulfill it from various reasons, in the fact nothing will happen. But this is not the case of the European Union, because this law is legal binding and also can be enforced. This is a very important issue that contrary to the most of these bilateral agreements, not only on nature or environment, but for example, on human rights or culture issue or some social issues, in the fact then can be enforced through the European Court of Justice, which is a court for the EU member states when the issue is related to the implementation of the European Union legislation. And the court is based in Luxembourg, and there are some stages. That means that first European Commission really informed the respective country that it is not fulfilling some duties which are a part of the EU legislation. Then there is some time for the country to reply, and some time to country to give the chance to improve it. And then the country is if not given to the European Court of Justice, where the country can explain why it is not able to fulfill its duties related to some piece of the EU legislation. Then the process or procedure will start, and it is then it's called infringement. And then if there is no chance still for the country to change it and to try to implement the legislation, and then can be some fees, some penalties to the country, which are quite high. They can be 100,000 euros each day by the time when the country is able to say, now we are fulfilling these duties. And in some cases, they can be even higher, because there can be some other penalties of fees to the country. But please distinguish between European Court of Justice, which is a body of the European Union dealing with the implementation, or better said, non-implementation or lack of implementation of the EU legislation by EU member states, and European Court of Human Rights, which is a Council of Europe body. Council of Europe is intergovernmental international organization dealing namely with the human rights. It was established in 1949, and headquarters is in Strasbourg. The European Court of Human Rights is based in Strasbourg, and this is the legal institution for European citizens, because they can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights if they recognize that there is no other higher court to be appealed within their cases. That means this is very last legal court in Europe, because Council of Europe has 54 members. That means not only 27 like the European Union, but almost all countries from pan-European region, except of Belarus, because Belarus is still keeping the death of penalty death, which is in the fact not allow to be more, that means people to be executed if the country wish to become a member of the Council of Europe. That means this death penalty. The photo here is from the European Commission headquarters. As I mentioned, this is the so-called Parliament Palace in the European Quarter. It was built in 1969, and the architects inspired by the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And this is building on the place of the former convent or girls' school, and it was rebuilt some years ago, and now it is for from 3,000 to 4,000 clerks, staff of the European Commission working there. But this is headquarters namely because it is the seat of the President of the European Commission, and so forth collegium of the European Commission members. That means European commissioners. And I can then tell you the story with the furniture in this. I said it to during my presentation, first face-to-face in conservation policy, but it is a very interesting story. And this is not only, let me say the duty, but most of the communitaire is very often positive. That means that it is accompanied by some funding. That means that EU member states are asked to do something, and at the same time some funds are available to do it. That means that it's not only to say you should do it, but there are some funds in many cases available, really helping the country to implement, because some of these implementations are not so easy or cannot be done in short term and so on. There are three main types of the European Union legislation. The first are regulations, And regulations are simply legal acts issued by the European Union bodies. That means European Commission, and approved by the Parliament, that apply automatically and uniformly to all EU member states as soon as they enter into force, without needing to be transposed into national law. That means that they are binding in their entirety on all the EU states. That means if the regulation is passed through the European Union authorities, it is automatically, word by word, a part of the national legislation of all the EU member states. That means that at the moment when the regulation entered into force, it is automatically considered as a new act or new law of the Czech Republic and other EU member states. That means directly, without no transposition, without no transition period, and so on. But at the same time, and probably even more common than regulations, are so-called directives. And the wording directive is quite appropriate, because directives require EU member states, countries, to achieve a certain result. That means there is some target, some goal, some result to be achieved by the member state by some period. But they leave to the member state freedom to choose how to do it. That means that is set, this is the goal, you should do it by 5, 3, 10 years, and the way you are going to do it is in your hands totally. That means that it is up to you how to do it. Using, for example, your legislation, using your political or historical or cultural tradition and so on. That means that they are much more open when comparing the regulation, and at the same time, these are most often really accompanied by some funds and so on. And EU member states must adopt measures to incorporate them into national law. That means this is about transposition. That means that the member states can say simply, we have been prepared and we have the peace legislation which is fully covering the issue, included in the directive, or saying it is the overlap with our current legislation at 80%, but we are going to pass the amendment to some acts or even a new act, really to incorporate the directives into national law, because it is necessary to achieve the objectives set by the directives, the targets, the goal, or the result just mentioned. And the third, I guess, less common type of EU legislation are decisions, and a decision shall be binding in its entirety. That means that the feature is similar to the regulations, but there is one difference, and the difference is that decision is not aiming at all the EU member states. They are directed to, for example, 1 or 2 member states, and namely, this is something dealing with very specific issues in some countries, which are so specific that couldn't be generalized for the EU as a whole. And therefore, the decisions are not so common, because they are very targeted, they are very tailored to some countries and their problems or difficulties or their experiences and so on. And therefore, a decision should be specified, saying it is addressed to these countries and so on, and then it is binding for them, of course, but not for all the EU member states. at the beginning, that means when the Treaty of Roma was agreed in 1958, and the European Economic Community was established, or better said, European communities, the European community legislation had aimed at technological protection of the environment through various standards. That means that since the late 1950s, the European community legislation dealt namely with the issues like air quality, water quality, or healthcare issue related to the environment and so on. And it was namely because they issued these standards. And this is very interesting that the approach is very common to the United Nations legislation, because you know that in the United States, the federal acts are as a minimal with respect of standards. That means that, for example, the United States Act on air quality, setting some standards for concentration of some contaminating chemical substances, and this is minimum. And individual states in the US can adopt their act, which are, for example, more stricter. And this is a very interesting fact that the most strict legislation on the environmental protection in the United States has been issued in California. That means in the biggest and the largest by the population and size, no, by the population of size. Texas is greater or more extensive, but with the population and with the economic power, you know that approximately 38% of the United States GDP is produced within California. And by the way, it was really surprisingly a very nice role of the governor of European origin, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who, for example, really pushed and because of his initiative, Californian Act on climate change are really very strict. So California have no problem with the Paris Agreement, because they are even stricter than in the European Union. And in the EU, these standards are common, and countries can, of course, also with the stricter standards, but mostly they are satisfied, because contrary to the United States, these standards are negotiated by the European Commission and EU member states. But what is very important is that, despite the fact that the issuing the European Community legislation had aimed at the technological protection of the environment, the EU nature conservation legislation has been the most comprehensive in the world. It was issued, or it entered in force quite later with respect of time frame when comparing some other sectors or elements of the environment, but it has been the most comprehensive in the world, and I will try to show to you now why. They have been really, that means namely these EU Birds and Habitats directives really have been pioneering in many aspects, and still they are a good example for many other countries, because except of one country which is considered to have the best legislation for not only nature conservation, but mainly for the environmental protection. And this is, as I really told to you during the first lecture, face-to-face, and this is Norway. Norway has at this moment better legislation in the environment than the European Union. But this is not the case of nature conservation. Still, the EU, so-called EU nature directives are probably the most powerful pieces of legislation dealing with nature conservation. First, pieces of legislation aiming at nature conservation was directive on the conservation of wild birds called the Birds Directive, and it was adopted in April 1979, but the original directive was replaced in November 29, and you can ask why the very first legislation aiming at nature conservation has been dealing with birds. There are some reasons. First, that really birds are charismatic, popular wild animals. There is a long tradition in bird conservation, comparing, for example, invertebrate conservation. There is a lot of bird watchers in the EU member states, or in the former EU member state in the United Kingdom. It is the third most popular activity during leisure time, and in some other countries this is also very popular. And to be honest, also because NGOs dealing with the bird conservation are relatively influential. They can lobby very effectively because, for example, as I mentioned, RSPB has more than 1 million members, but they have 4 other million supporters in the UK, which are willing to undersign petition or to support also some politicians aiming to come with some measures in protection of this vertebrate group. Therefore, not surprisingly, in the EU, the first pieces of legislation of at the time, you can see it was EC, it was European Community, because it was also before the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, and now why we can say that the Birds Directive entered into force in the early 1980s was really a milestone, even from the global point of view of nature conservation or biodiversity management. It is because it was we can say it, that it was a revolution in species protection. Why? Yeah, and the photo was the Eurasian Curlew, Numenius arcuata, which is wader, still living in the farmland, and it is also species declining in the European Union, namely in the western part, in the Netherlands and Belgium, and of course in the UK. This species, I'm sure that it is really well known to you. This is the Eurasian spoonbill, which is Planta Europa with this distinctive shape of the bill, and it is also declining, but also it is because Europe is on the edge of its distribution range, but very nice and popular species. I took this photo in the Netherlands in the Ribe National Park. And what was the revolution in the nature conservation legislation introduced by the Birds Directive? First, it was that it came with the idea of general protection. It is quite new because image the situation that by the issuing the Birds Directive, species, some species were specially protected. That means that there were some acts on their protection, there were some enforcement or some action plans, some funds, but the Bird Directive milestone is that it introduced general protection of all the bird species and subspecies living on the territory of the, at the time, European Community member states, but also in all the development stages, like eggs and young. That means that it was said all bird species, except some which are considered to be pests, making harm to human health, or really, for example, also causing economic losses and so on, or harmful to the, for example, airplane traffic and so on, are protected. Also, the exceptions are of course game species. That means that, simply said, it should be a really serious reason, for example, to kill a bird individual in the European Union, at least formally, because all the bird species and species are protected. And also it was taken from the piece of legislation which was passed before the, but I guess 2 weeks before the Birds Directive, and this is the international multilateral agreement called Convention on the Conservation of European Fauna and Flora and Natural Habitats, known as the Bern Convention. And the bird directives took from this convention also measures for animal welfare, because it imaged the situation. It was in the late 1970s, there was no strong movement for the animal welfare. There were no pieces of legislation almost dealing with animal welfare. And these birds directives sets some bans, saying that it is not allowed, for example, to kill birds if you are using lights, or it is not allowed to kill birds from boats, or you should not kill or capture birds using, for example, recorders, and so on. That means that there are some prohibitions aiming not for the protection of the species as a whole, but to protect individual. That means really it is a pioneering piece of legislation with respect of animal welfare. And the third issue to be stressed is that even for game species which can be hunted within the European Union, they are a part of a special annexes to the Birds Directive. It is not allowed to do it in the breeding, that means in the nesting season. This is contrary to some national act, for example, when it was, for example, some cold game pests were allowed to be killed, like, for example, magpie in former Czechoslovakia, even during breeding season. That means that hunters really killed and destroyed the nest by shooting and destroying eggs or young, but it is prohibited within the Birds Directive. And in addition, a special attention is paid to migratory and wetland bird species. Migratory because, again, let me remind the proverb that nature doesn't respect geopolitical borders, and wetland bird species, it was because, let me again remind us that the wetlands has been still, and even more, it was really correct in the late 90s, 70s, the most threatened and most often destroyed habitat types. And for particularly threatened 194 species and subspecies, member states must designate special protection areas. That means that it is strongly said that for each species there should be special protection areas as a part of the Natura 2000 ecological network. That means it is not to say that member states could or can establish for protection of these species listed in the Annex 1 to the Birds Directive, but this is their obligation, and even more, they can do it not to protect, for example, one not important site for the very particular species, but the best sites for breeding, nesting, resting during migration or wintering or so on. That means not to say we will fulfill the duty that there is some site which is not so important because there is no economic value and we put it as a protected area for the species. Not. It should be the most important, and also I will reach it later, it should be based on the proportionality principle. There is an example of the species great bastard, because you know that this is the really heavy flying bird species which is declining across its distribution range in Europe, not only within the EU. Now there are two really important strangleholds for this species, Spain and Ukraine. And for example, Central European population has been declining dramatically. In the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria. In Austria it is increasing, but namely in Hungary and in Slovakia it was a relatively sad story, because you know the species is heavy and it needs some time to reach some height when flying, and there was one single electric power line which killed really most of the Slovak population before it was removed. And now there are even some attempts to recover the species by restocking, like in Central Europe, or reintroduction like in United Kingdom. The other important directive is Directive on the Conservation of Natural Habitats and of Wild Fauna and Flora, so-called Habitats Directive. And this is the directive dealing with other nature than birds, of course. And it was adopted in May 1992 before the famous United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, called also Air Summit, which was held in June 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, really being a milestone in the development of global nature conservation or biodiversity protection, better said. And it was considered as a contribution of the European Economic Community to the global nature conservation or biodiversity protection. And to be honest, I'm sure that nowadays it would not be possible to be passed, because it is very strong. And at the time, let me remind us that, as I tried to show to you during the first face-to-face lecture on conservation policy in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a strong support to environmental issues from global general public. There was a boom of interest on environmental issue, which unfortunately has not been repeated again. And therefore, simply said, we can leave from this piece of legislation, and there were really many attempts to reduce the power of this Habitats Directive. And the photo is from site which is also a part of the EU Natura 2000 ecological network, and this is from the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland. It is early May, but still there was a snow. And the Habitats Directive is the most comprehensive nature conservation legal tool worldwide. Why? Because it sets special, that means very strict protection for approximately 400 species and subspecies of other taxa or ecological groups than birds, which are important for the European Union as a whole. That means it is coming with the list of the, it's Annex 2 and Annex 3, with plans dealing with the strict protection of these species. The photo here is, I'm very proud of this photo because this is a photo of the European mink, Mustela luteola, which is critically endangered by the spreading of the American mink. And you know that there are few viable populations still living in the wild, because American mink is, because this is bigger and more successful in preying and so on, it is really, and also there are hybrids between American and European minks, and therefore there are only few remaining population, like this is from the Danube Delta River, Danube River Delta. There are few remaining populations in the strip from Brittany in France to southern Spain, but most of them are, and now the bad news is that the most viable now, there is only, it seems to me, 300 kilometers from the nearest occurrence of the American mink. That means this is the question of time when the American mink arrive and destroy the population. There are some remaining populations in Russia, and the most important at this moment are Estonian population, because Estonians really took an important step, because they reintroduced the species on islands close to the Estonian coast, where there are no American minks and no other predators, and these populations are restocking from the breeding at the Tallinn Zoo. That means that these are the, probably this moment, the threshold of this mustard species still occurring but being critically endangered. And this is also strictly protected by the Habitats Directive. But even more, that means that protected sites are established directly for the particular taxa. There is another annex saying that for these species, EU member states are obliged to establish protected sites. That means, again, similar to the Birds Directive. But what is difference? And therefore it is important to see that in the title of the directive there is of natural habitats. That means that not only species but also natural habitats are directly protected, because similar to the fauna and flora, EU member state should designate EU Natura 2000 sites also for the specific natural habitat types. That means that the legislation, and this is again innovation, that means that, because for example, even in the Endangered Species Act, which was passed in 1973 in the United States under the presidency of Richard Nixon, which is relatively strong, and which introduced the concept of critical habitats, saying that for the species covered by the Endangered Species Act, there are some critical habitats to be maintained. And but even in the Endangered Species Act, there is no chance to for example, to establish or to declare protected area because of the presence of the natural type, like, for example, peat bogs or grassland, dry grassland, and so on. And the photo here, I'm sure that I showed to you, but it is quite good illustration of this approach, because this is very interesting certain habitat, which is called frigana. It is in the habitat type from Mediterranean, something like bushy habitats. And I took a photo on the coast of the island of Malta, in one of the Natura 2000 sites in Malta. That means that the Habitats Directive combines species and territorial protection or conservation. And for 90 wildlife species and subspecies, management should be sustainable, keeping the favorable conservation status. That means that it is said that some species can be harvested, can be hunted, but it should be done on the sustainable limits, on the sustainable way, to keep the favorable conservation status. And for more than 900 wildlife taxa, that means fauna other than birds and plants, unfortunately not for fungi, for example, and approximately 200 natural habitat types, member states must designate sites of so-called sites of community importance, or which then become special areas of conservation, respectively, like for the European bison. That means, again, it is not said that you can do it. You should do it, and you can do it on the best science available and proportionality in proportional principle, and also to seek for the best sites with the occurrence of the both fauna species or wildlife species or natural habitat types. With respect of importance of the EU Natural 2000 network, protected areas which consists of sites designated under both Birds and Habitats directives, is that targets parts of nature are protected in situ. Sites are declared so that the target parts of nature are maintained in favorable conservation status, or the latter has been improving. That means that it is not the duty of the country to establish protected area, Natura 2000 site, in the site where the species or natural habitat occurs, being the most important or one of the most important on the member states' territory, but it would be enough, because really to declare the site is not enough. That means that the duty or the EU member states are in charge to maintain the species as a whole and the species within the Natura 2000 site in the favorable conservation status, and even try to improve it. And as I'm going to show you later, it is not easy task, and still we have been failing, although the legislation is so strong. And there is a biogeographical, not the geopolitical approach applied. That means that the sites are not selected within the country territory only, or not selected on the territory, but within the biogeographical zones within the country, for example, continental or alpine or Mediterranean. That means that, for example, the area covered by the Mediterranean biogeographical zone is considered as one unit. And within the Mediterranean biogeographical zone in France, France is obliged to come with the best sites for declaring the Natura 2000 sites. But of course, there are some countries which are really harboring more than one biogeographical zone, some of them even 4 or 5, and large countries with the relatively diverse nature. That means that they have to really have 4 or 5 or 6 lists of Natura 2000 sites separately for each biographical zone. And it is really the issue which is so strong that I can illustrate to you on the case of the Czech Republic, because we have most of the country covered. 95% of the country is covered by the continental biogeographical zone, but in the southeast part of the country there is Pannonium biogeographical zone. And now we debated before starting the process of the joining the EU whether we should have really 2 biogeographical zones or 1, because having 1 our life would be much more easier. But we decided to have 2 because I remember I said at the meeting when we debated it, it would be blamage because people are aware that there is Pannonicum, not only scientists. So we have 2 zones, 2 lists, and 2 activities related to 2 biogeographical zones. By the way, for example, Austria said that they have no Pannonicum, and they were successful in this. And the sites to be selected on the scientific basis. That means that not to say this is the best site for the species because there are no problems, no development, no threats. It could be even most threatened site, but of the most important significance for the species. That means fully on the scientific base, not on decision of the politicians or decision makers. Then, for conservation of the wildlife species and habitat targeted, both the respective member states and the EU are responsible. That means the proportionality principle. We can say, for example, that at this moment the greatest responsibility for the European mink is in hands of Estonia, having the greatest part of the EU population of the species on its territory. That means it depends on the proportion of the numbers or distribution range within the respective country. That means more distribution range, more individuals of the species means there is high responsibility in the hand of the respective EU member state. Then, on the other hand, the Natura 2000 sites have not been strictly protected and pristine. What is important is to maintain the status of the protected phenomenon like species, habitats, or species in habitats is crucial to maintain the favorable conservation status. But it doesn't exclude economic activities which are not harmful for the maintaining the favorable conservation status of the species or habitats. And also what is the important issue that member states are obliged to consider drivers outside the sites. For example, if there is the Natura 2000 site for example, Eurasian otter, somewhere on the downstream of the river, but if there is some pollution in the upstream, member states should do something with the pollution even being outside the Natura 2000 site. And this is a very important issue. But as I mentioned, the economic activities like agriculture, tourism are not excluded if they are not changing the favorable conservation status. I can show you again the example when we started with the preparing the Natura 2000 network in my country. I was in charge as chief advisor. Then there was really a strong misunderstanding because there were even some articles saying now, you know, that people will leave the protected sites to be included in the Natura 2000, like in Africa, leave their homes and so on. And this is totally nonsense, yeah, because, for example, we have a water dam in the northern Bohemia, which is second the most important site for turnover, for stopping of grey goose in the country, or for wintering. But it definitely does not mean that there should be, because people say now we will close it, there will be no recreation on the water reservoir, we can have cottages there and we should close it. We say no, because this site is important from October to March because of this bird species, yeah, but not for the whole season. And special attention should be paid to monitoring, both at the national level, that means the conservation status of the species at the national level, as well as the conservation, as I mentioned, conservation status of the phenomenon at the sites, assessment and reporting. That means that this is not to declare or establish Natura 2000 site and to stop everything activities. Member states should really to monitor the status and to be able to say whether they are able to maintain a favorable conservation status. But also, I put photo here because also the citizen science is very important when gathering the data on some species, like bird species or some plant species and so on. For example, orchids. And by the number of sites, the Natura 2000 is the largest network of protected areas worldwide, based on the same principle. Not by the size. There are more extensive sites like national park in Greenland or in Saudi Arabia, but with a number of the sites, definitely the largest network of protected areas. Because in March, last month, the Natura 2000 network consists of approximately 28,000 sites covering 80% of the EU land area, but there is still deficit of the marine sites in Natura 2000. And there are some repeated attempts to reduce the EU Nature Directive power, and I can show to you it because then later. But on the other hand, the Natura 2000 network generates recreation benefits worth between 5 and 6 billion euros per year. That means this is for the entrance fees and money which tourists or visitors spend in these areas and so on. That means that this is really not strictly protected, like for example zapovedniks in former USSR, but they are open to the public if there are no harm to the favorable conservation status. I took a photo in the Triglav National Park in Slovenia, famous mountain area in Julian Alps. And the provision of ecosystem services by the Natura 2000 have been estimated to be in order between 200 to 300 billion euros per year. That means that really, if we estimate the benefits generated by Natura 2000 site, you can see that this is huge amount of money. And the photo here is from the Ardennes Highland in Belgium. And this is interesting because this area was usually similar to, you can see on the upper part of the photo, that means it was spruce plantations, spruce monocultures. But owners, and I would like to say that these were owners, not government ordering, but owners decided to change these spruce plantations back to the peat box. And they did it at the beginning for their own funds, for their own money. Then they asked for some subsidies, and you can see that they were relatively successful, because this is unbelievable. It was only 20 years really when there were only spruce plantations, and you can see that it was a really typical root nature conservation. It was bottom-up approach. There was no direction nor enforcement. People decided to do because they like to have peat box there instead, even that taking into account that spruce plantations are definitely more profitable. Which are shortcomings of the nature conservation legislation? It is necessary to say which are the shortcomings, because you know that sometimes we have the tendency not to speak about the shortcomings. I remember that 4 years ago I was the coordinating lead author of the United Nations Global Environment Assessment for Europe in chapters dealing with biodiversity, and there was a nice person, and I asked her to write something about the Natura 2000, and she came saying that everything is perfect, but as the title of this famous US comedy, nobody is perfect, and therefore let me say where are the shortcomings, not to saying that but to aware us where are the weak part of the legislation, not legislation itself, but probably its implementation. First is the delay in the Natura 2000 designation, which was almost 20 years, because when you are considering why the ecological network, or better said network of protected areas of the EU importance called Natura 2000, when the title appeared, why there is 2000, because idea was that the network, the designation will finish by 2000, but it was 20 years, almost 20 years later. That means that that this delay, because this is complicated process, although there are not all people in favor of it, and so on. But anyhow, we can say that it has happened. We have, at least on the terrestrial land, a really very good system of protected areas of the EU importance. The second was that based on the assessment which was done based on reporting from the parties, because European Topic Center on Biological Diversity is assessing the national reports, they are seeking whether countries are using the appropriate data, whether they are not really saying that something is better than in the reality. And we as the agency, we as members of or partner of the ETCBD, we are always dealing with the data from some countries now. We finished last January, for example, assessing the quality of the nature conservation with respect of Natura 2000 and then nature directives implementation in one EU member state. But what was really clear is that still, despite having so strong and strict measures, but also taking account that some conservation measures need to have some time to really to be seen in the field, to appear that they are successful. But still 60% of the species assessment, that means now I'm speaking about species covered by the Habitats Directive, show unfavorable conservation status. That means that, simply said, for most species covered by the Habitats Directive, we are not able to fulfill the commitments from the piece of legislation. 60%, there is failure. And the worst state is in fish, mollusks, and amphibians. But there is, of course, significant gap of knowledge in marine species. So when speaking about the worst status in fish, mollusks, and amphibians, it should be taken into account that we are speaking about species inhabiting terrestrial, freshwater habitats, respectively. Only 16% of the assessment of habitats protected under the Habitats Directive have a favorable conservation status at the EU level. That means that it is even worse when speaking about natural habitat types, not about species, but natural habitat types. And the worst situation is in peat bogs, marshes, and fens, followed closely by grassland. Yeah, you can see that forests are relatively well covered by the Habitats Directive. And also, only half of the bird species in the Birds Directive, or which are covered by the Birds Directive, are considered to be secure. That means having favorable conservation status. This is Pite, Avocet, Recurvirostra, Avoceta, with the typical bill, and again, this is species where we are not able to really, at all the sites, to maintain the favorable conservation status, because this is species really very vulnerable to some stresses from some drivers like eutrophication or contamination by some chemical substances. And also declared in the Habitats Directive that Natura 2000 is an ecological network, this is not the case. Remind us what I said during the last lecture, that ecological network should consist of core areas and biocorridors, both stepping stone or linear, but there are no biocorridors between the respective Natura 2000 site, except of some natural corridors like watercourses, streams, and so on. But no, let me say, man-made or some corridors in the wider landscape protected or managed because being corridors. That means it is only by the name ecological network. But to be honest, we would appreciate the effort of the European Commission, because now European Commission is paid more attention to the connectivity of the site than it was previously. And also there is the problem with the size of the sites, because not only in the European Union we prepared a report on the status of protected areas in Europe for the European Environment Agency, and we found that in Europe approximately 93, it's really a high number, 93% of the protected areas are less than 10 square kilometers, and 78% even are less than 1 square kilometer of size. That means, okay, we have 28,000 Natura 2000 sites, but the question is how they are great, how they are extensive, because number is quite well, but the problem is, and now immediate situation that, for example, large carnivores like grey wolves is able in tundra to move each night for more than 150 kilometers. In Europe it is less, but still it is able to run 75 kilometers per night. How to keep the species in protected areas in Europe if 93% are less than 10 square kilometers? And as I mentioned, there is deficit of marine Natura 2000 sites. You can see a grey wolf here. And again, what was said, although there is the duty of the EU member states to keep the protected phenomena on this site in favorable conservation status, and birds and other wildlife species in favorable conservation status at the national level, still the designation itself is not guarantee of effective biodiversity conservation. And probably you are surprised by the fact that only half of the Natura 2000 sites have a management plan. That means that they have some phenomena to be protected, designated, the way how to do it, who is in charge, what about the time framework, what about the finances. And this is half only. This is quite low number because, of course, they can be very formal. But for us, it is really a surprise because we have, for us, it is a duty for each specially protected area to have management plan, to be agreed by stakeholders, to allocate funds and so on. And this is the case only half of the Natura 2000 sites. That means still there is quite good gap to come from the paper to the field to the reality. Then the Natura 2000 network has been built on past and present, not on the future. What does it mean? That means that there was a very nice analysis prepared by the group of very clever men dealing with the impact of climate change on biological diversity, led by Professor Araujo, Spanish guy but now being in the UK, but before in Copenhagen University. And they simply modeled how the species and habitats are going to leave Natura 2000 site under various climate change scenarios. And it was not very good news because it was demonstrated that due to the fact that the highest proportion of Natura 2000 sites are located in the flat landscape, that means that there is little chance for plants or animals or even through them to habitats to move to the higher elevation or to the more close to the North Pole, to the north towards, because the landscape is flattened. This is the photo taken in the East England, where there is a very important site for some species, reed beds and so on, but this nature reserve, but still this is really quite flat, quite lowland type. And unfortunately, there is no special line in the EU budget for Natura 2000. The photo is from I was showing to you a similar photo last lecture. The photo is from the Plitvice Lake National Park in Croatia. Very nice landscape, but as I mentioned, visited by more than 3 million visitors, but they generate quite a high amount of money for the national park and other national park in Croatia. But this is not the case of most, although they generate some money from the tourists, but there is no special line in the EU budget for Natura 2000, which is the problem. I can show to you the importance of having a special line in the budget in my country, because when we started with the preparation or designation Natura 2000 network of protected areas in the Czech Republic, it was very clear that we have a lack of time to do it. And we originally were considering to ask for transition period. That means to ask to have some years after joining the EU for complete the task. That means to have really, based on the best data available, Natura 2000 site in the Czech Republic. And what we have done that we try to consider with the European Commission the transition period for the implementation of the Birds and Habitat Directive. I was personally sometimes in Brussels to speak with the appropriate persons, really to try to convince them for this, but then it was the policy of the EU, and it is very clear that it was reasonable because they said no transition period, because if we will give you transition period, there is still a delay for EU member state at the time, before 2004, and they will slow their efforts if they will recognize that you have a transition period. So then we approached the main negotiator of the joining the EU, and we explained to him what we need. We need time, money, and ideally time and money. We need no time more. So he decided to give us money, and he gave us, it was for 3 years approximately. It seems to me that it was 25, yes, 25 or 30 million euros. And what we did, we really be able to have more than 400 people mapping habitats and species in the field. We were able not only to do it, but to pay volunteers, even to ask people to leave their jobs in universities or Academy of Sciences or NGOs or museums, and to pay them for 3 years for mapping. So we got a lot of data on habitat distribution. And then it was a special line in the budget. And then when we joined the EU, we said ourselves, okay, that's the pity because now we lost the money. And then there was a call to me from Minister of Finances, and they asked me, you know, we have this strange title here in the state budget, Natura 2000, and that is not so high amount of money like in the previous year, but still there are some 3 million, 4 million euros per year. I said, yes, this is for the monitoring. So we were able to start with our monitoring, biological diversity monitoring scheme, because, and still we have this special budget line in the state budget, and this is important. But this is not the case of the EU budget, unfortunately. There is no special funds for not only establishing but also for managing the Natura 2000 sites to maintain their favorable conservation status. And of course there is Life Plus fund, but this is fund also used for research, for communication, education, public awareness, not only for the nature conservation management measures to be taken in the field. And therefore it was said that, for example, for some regions in Europe, we can use the funds from cohesion funds, where a lot of money still or had been available. But you know that this is unfortunately probably not the case anymore, because you know that, for example, that funds for the recovering the economy for COVID-19 plague disease pandemic was taken or will be taken from the cohesion funds. That means that there will be less money available for the nature conservation than even previously. And to be honest, we also failed because there were some NGOs lobbying for having special funds for Natura 2000 establishing and management, but we failed. There was not so strong support from either the European Parliament or European Council. And there was the Natura 2000 health check, because in May 2014, the President of European Commission, then Jean-Claude Juncker announced that there will be deep analysis of the directives to be more current and to be merged. But it was very clear that probably this is not only the case, but there were strong pressures behind to have more modern, more current legislation to be not so strong. And there were worries about reducing the power of the directives because they are still, as I mentioned, relatively powerful. And fortunately, against any changes in the directives, they were not only European Parliament and scientists and NGO, there was even a petition called Nature Alert. ENCA, this is the European Network of Conservation Agencies, and even a part of private sectors, for example, medium and small entrepreneurs, some small farmers and so on, they were in favor to not to open the Pandora box and to keep and to maintain the legislation as strong as they are at this moment. And therefore, European Commission introduce a so-called online public consultation. That means that any citizen of any EU member state can provide the European Commission with his opinion on some issue, and it was about the changes in Natura 2000 directives, and more than 500,000 citizens were involved. 95% or 97% of them say we are against any changes, and it has been the highest number of citizens involved in any public consultation dealing with the environment. It is even more than when some for example, directives or regulation dealing with the contamination, chemicals, or human health have been debated through internet. Yeah. That means that it was a strong signal that citizens of the European Union member states are strongly for this nature conservation tool. And fortunately, there was strong support to the directives from some member states like Germany, UK, France, Croatia, Slovenia, Spain, and the Czech Republic, when the ministry said, don't open it. It is enough. We have even some difficulties in implementation, and we would like to keep it because we would like to have a really healthy nature and therefore healthy Europeans. And December 2016, it was decided to keep the status quo. That means not to change it. That means it has been a great victory of nature conservation in the European Union. But again, this is good evidence that both the directives are so strong that some, for example, developers or some sectors are strongly against to have so influential pieces of legislation. Generally, Natura 2000 is ecological, from point of view of conservation and ecological network, quite a success. There is the photo from the very first site declared under the Habitats Directive as a part of the Natura 2000. This is Morro del Castelo Branco in one of the Azores Islands, part of the Portugal. And now it is more than millions square kilometers. Again, this is not the biggest network of protected areas, but by the number of sites, yes. But to be honest, it has not met a high ambition because please refer to the so high number of species and habitats which are in unfavorable conservation status. And let me continue now. I will be much more brief with the regulation of invasive alien species. And because in Europe, number of invasive alien species increase 4 times since the beginning of the 20th century. You can see one of the examples. This is gray squirrel, which is really causing the decline in the red squirrel, native red squirrel in Europe, where it's so named in the United Kingdom. It's from North America, but unfortunately, the gray squirrel really is browsing on the top of the tree around, and the tree is becoming dried. And this is also not only because really being able due to competition to really move out the native red squirrel, but because of this economic pressure. And you know that now there are some parts of the United Kingdom where there is no red squirrel more, that the red squirrel is considered to be critical endangered in the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, now there is another population of gray squirrel which is viable, which is in Italy, because it was the species was as a pet in homes in Italy. It was reintroduced in the wild and becoming to spread, and the Italian Agency for Nature Conservation tried to eradicate the species, being aware of the situation in the United Kingdom, but one of the animal welfare organization in Italy put this agency to the court, and the court decided to stop the activities before coming to the conclusion, to the decision. The decision was taken, and it was said that Nature Conservation Agency of Italy can do it, but it took some years, and now the population is so viable that it couldn't be eradicated. And in my opinion, it is not a question of time, but it is question of dozen of years when it will move. It will pass through the Alps and move to the center Europe, because now the population is so viable, and there are very nice forests on the southern foothill of the Alps, and it can pass it and move forwards, because now they couldn't be even effectively controlled. It's too late. Annual loss caused by the invasive alien species in the EU is approximately 12 billion. It's quite a high number. And there is a special regulation recently issued. There is a list of the invasive alien species of union concern, the union list, and these species are not allowed to be more introduced or released. If they are in captivity, they should stop to be reproduced, only to be really to survive by the end of their lives, but not to reproduce. And at this moment, there is 66 animal and plant species and subspecies listed there. And this is, I'm sure that you recognize it. This is Slider turtle, Trachemys crypta from Central America, which is spreading, which is really a very effective competitor because of being able to prey on almost everything by some size. And now it is even reproducing in the Czech Republic, because now much more warmer winters. It's able to survive winters and to reproduce even in Central Europe. And this is one of the species listed in the union list. To show to you, you can see there is the map. That means that green means a low number of invasive alien species. And more and more species, you can see that invasive alien species are relatively common in the United Kingdom. At the time, it was a part of our EU member state. You can see, namely, Netherlands, Belgium, some parts of Germany, and surprisingly also some parts of Poland. These are the countries with the highest number of invasive alien species within the European Union. And to illustrate the situation, as I mentioned, there is an exponential growth of still more and more invasive alien species coming to Europe. also because of the synergistic effect with climate change. For example, for some marine species, we are even speaking about tropicization of the Mediterranean Sea, because there is a lot of tropical species coming through Suez Canal to Mediterranean. I would like only to refer to one jellyfish species which can be toxic, or even for humans, and so on. And you can see that the growth is really exponential. So it is really a problem which should be covered by the regulation. To say start immediately to do it, not to have some time for transposing it to when it would be in the case of directive. There is a water framework directive targeting the water, including coastal marine waters, and area was that it was passed in just at the beginning of the millennium, and the idea was that in 15 years all EU waters to be in good quality. But the reality is that it is slightly more than one half. That means still the ambitions are high, the reality is not so good from various reasons, of course. Which are parameters to be in good quality? For example, biological, ecological, that means the number of fish species, invertebrate species, the viability of the population, and so on, species richness and diversity, and so on. Hydromorphological, like, for example, speed of the water column, and then physical, chemical, like the quality of the bottom, or the river bank quality, for example, and the chemical quality of the water, of course. And what is important, that there was the ecosystem approach applied. That means that whether the waters are or are not in the good quality, the assessment is carried out using ecosystem approach, because it is done in the river basins, like Elbe River or Rhone River or Rhine River or Danube River or less, not so huge, but on the river basin approach to see, because river basins are of course natural ecosystem. They have natural boundaries. They are naturally delineated. And also another piece of legislation is Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Is directive, and the idea was that there will be good environmental status in the EU member states seas by 2020. And again, it is very clear that it definitely will not happen. Again, that EU member states were not able to fulfill this duty. And the special attention is paid to biodiversity, even during the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Then there is regulation on international wildlife trade, so-called CITES regulation. What is the most important issue? That this regulation are stricter than the convention itself, the Convention on the International Trade with Endangered Species. The species which are listed in the Annex A are species from the annexes of the convention, but there are more species, and there are even some species which are not listed within CITES list, because, for example, they are not so important with respect to the thrive at the global level, but at the EU level, definitely. Again, nice piece of legislation, but where is the problem? The problem is that species which individuals of the species which are legally on the territory of the EU member states, being legally traded or being born there under the checking by the respective authorities and so on, they will receive so-called yellow passport. That means that they are able to be traded or moved or exchanged between breeders or keepers on the whole territory of the European Union. That means this is something like passport. But the problem is that this is the join the common market. That if the species will receive this yellow passport, it is very hard, if not impossible, to check it, whether really the origin is really legally based. And EU still is one of the biggest wildlife trade market. And I'm showing to you this photo of this guy. This is, of course, bottlenose dolphin. And I'm showing to you that common bottlenose dolphin, Tursiops truncatus, and I'm showing to you that this is, there are many attempts to try to go through various EU member states with the animals, with the dolphin, which are of illegal origin. Simply the traders are trying whether the appropriate CITES authorities or authorities dealing with this regulation are vulnerable, whether they have knowledge to stop it because it is not prohibited. And we have even some cases in the Czech Republic that we were pushed to issue permits for the dolphins being declared to be born in Ukraine facilities, but we know from the data that this is not the case. We were even pressed by some mafia because it would be totally super profitable if there will be some performances in the Czech Republic and so on, because we have no permanent delphinarium and so on. And we recognize that the traders try to pass it through Croatia, Italy, Greece, and some other countries, but they failed. And therefore, the coordination of the common effort how to really handle with the international wide plant and animal trade is extremely important. There are key biodiversity document I will jump over, and I will say that the most recent document dealing with the policy document dealing with the biodiversity is a document called Our Life Insurance, Our Natural Capital, and EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2020. That is the photo from Olympus National Park, but not Olympus National Park in Greece, but on Cyprus. And there are 6 targets. First, for implement Birds Directive, maintain and to restore ecosystems and their services, increase the contribution of agriculture and forestry to biodiversity, and ensure the sustainable use of fisheries resources, combat invasive alien species, and, because we are not living in splendid isolation, step up action to tackle the global biodiversity crisis and the EU responsibility. You know, again, that the targets are quite ambitious, and again, based on the assessment and evaluation having been made, it is clear that the targets have not been met. And the question is what will be the next year, because we failed 2010, we failed now, and we have the third attempt to come with the realistic targets, at the same time ambitious, and to really be able to involve stakeholders and politicians and decision makers to biodiversity-related issue. And last policy I would like to deal with respect of the EU is a common agriculture policy, because it started in 1968. Even it's mentioned in the Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community. And this is key EU policy instrument because in the past more than half of the EU budget was allocated for the common agriculture policy implementation, namely for the subsidies for direct agriculture production. And this is and it was quite a high amount of money. Which are the official tasks of the common agriculture policy? First is provide consumers with high quality and easy available food. It seems that it is common and it is almost really not to be mentioned. This is a platitude. This is really something which is very clear. But it is the situation that it was debated in the late 1950s when there was not so high amount of foods available in Europe. It was only, let me say, 10, 12 years after the World War II. And therefore, this was the main aim, to avoid the problem with the lack of food or to avoid the problem with the low quality of the food. The second target of the common agriculture policy is maintaining stable and consumer-friendly food prices, because the idea was to support and to have policy for agriculture production which avoid the dramatic fluctuations in the prices of bread or meat or eggs or milk or so on, to avoid the having lack of this food on the market. The third was enhance well-being of citizens in the countryside, because now we have more than 70% of the citizens of the EU member states living in the cities, but it was again late 1950s when most people were living in the countryside, and the idea was, please try to minimize the standard of living differences between the cities and the countryside. Then the next was support economic development in the rural region, saying through creating generating jobs and incomes we will be able to, and also to support various economic and culture and historical development in the rural regions, even like traditions and so on, tradition among farmers and so on. And support long-term export, because in the fact when exporting food from the EU, the food is subsidized twice, one for production and one for the export. And there were even some years where most of funds paid for the implementation of common agriculture policy, it was 30 years ago, for example, were spent for export, even not for the enhancing living of people in the countryside. Even from the beginning, and this is a real never-ending story, there was strong recognition that because world is so dynamic that we should really try to adapt the common agriculture policy and come with the reform. And since the beginning, we are speaking about the necessity to have a common agriculture policy reform. There are two pillars of the common agriculture policy. One is pillar 1, production support, sometimes called direct support. The second is pillar 2, rural development. As you can see, among the key common agriculture policy tasks, there is no single word about the environment. And there are problems in the organization which is called World Trade Organization, which is not United Nations body. It is intergovernmental organization, but being very powerful, to be almost more powerful than United Nations at this moment. And there is a strong group of countries called Miami Group, consisting of countries outside the EU, having strong and important agriculture, food, agriculture products export, like the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and they are called to Miami Group, and they are always really making troubles to the EU, or really tabling again and again the issue of the EU subvention to the agriculture. And then there is new common agriculture policy for the period 2021 to 2030. What is very clear, and we try to come with the evidence, is that so-called greening of the common agriculture policy, that means to come with the more environmental friendly agriculture policy within the EU, is not sufficient. That now funds from the common agriculture policy, which were considered to be allocated for environmental protection, are allocated for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Agriculture still has been one of the most important biodiversity loss drivers, and also agro-environmental schemes, that means now they are even called agro-environmental climate schemes, which really should support activities of farmers which are friendly or even supporting nature conservation. There are differences in EU member states. They are not always efficient, unfortunately. And of course, money taken from these agro-environmental schemes are taken from the pillar 2. That means we are competing with the well-being issues, we are competing with the climate change and so on. And my last slide will be, you know, that the new commission established after the election to the European Parliament last year declared that its priority is so-called Green Deal. That means to improve the environment, and namely to improve our efforts with respect of climate change mitigation and adaptation, namely so-called decarbonization. It was declared as a priority of this commission for its period when it will be functioning. Even, you know, that the vice president, there was a special vice president from the Green Deal, the debate has started, but the question is what will be with respect of the post-COVID-19 situation, because now it is clear that some EU member states will ask to slowly it and to use money allocated for the Green Deal to be spent for measurements, economic, social, and so on, to mitigate the negative effect of this disease plague. But you know that today there was the announcement of the European Commission, the President of the European Commission, that they are still trying to keep time and money for the Green Deal, but definitely it will be a question of hard negotiation. So now I will stop it, and now I would like to ask for questions.
Okay, so please, if there are any questions for Dr. Plesník. I know there is one in the chat from Ruby, but I don't understand what he means exactly. So if can Ruby repeat the question, please? It seems there are no questions.
Yes, so can break, I guess.
Okay, if there are no questions, thank you very much to everybody to be with us. And I would like to invite to everybody for our next seminar around 25 minutes later. We will start at 3:45 p.m. So thank you very much and see you later.
See you later, thank you.